Hi. So for this week, I'm just going to go over the questions that we were prompted for this week's module. The first one was, what terms were the most important concepts of this week's lesson? And be sure to define any important terms in your own words. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is disaster, because that was a big one of this module and of the whole class. So a disaster, in my opinion, would be something that does harm or damage to a large group of people or a big area, or I guess it could be a small area too, but when I think disaster, I think a lot of damage. And one of the definitions that we were given of disaster was a sudden event that strongly affects society by creating economic, environmental, and or human damage. And quantitatively, at least 100 human deaths or injuries, or at least 1 billion economic damages, which is a lot. So, and then something I found informative was the Bradford Disaster Scale, and that went over like how many deaths in a disaster equals the magnitude of the disaster, which I thought was interesting. I never heard of that before. And something else that stood out to me throughout the text was the 4 theories of disaster. The first one is acts of God, which pretty much means it was just fate. It just was the way it is. It was in God's plan, and disasters happen. So that kind of mindset, which I thought was interesting, which I hadn't ever heard of before until recently, actually. I live really close to Tanger Outlets, and I don't know if any of you have heard about the sinkhole that happened. They're debating between it being an act of God or if it was like something that went wrong with the people with the excavating company. So that was the first time I ever actually heard of a situation being called an act of God. And the second one is acts of nature, which pretty much means Mother Nature is to blame. And other than those two, I hadn't really heard of the other ones before. The next one is intersection of society and nature, which means humans putting themselves in the way of hazards. So then the humans would be to blame for putting themselves in between the hazard and society. And then the fourth one is avoidable human constructions, which means disasters are brought on to humans by humans. So that kind of goes into the next one. The next point, which is what was your muddiest point, or what didn't make sense? And that was actually one of them to me, the human culpability view of disaster, which also means disasters are brought upon humans by other humans. I hadn't ever looked at disaster from that perspective before. I always just thought it was something of nature, unless it was something that a company did wrong in their building of something that led to a disaster. But that was kind of interesting to me, and I don't know if it fully makes sense. I'm sure by the end of the semester it will make sense, but right now it's kind of a little bit muddy. And the second one is that disasters don't kill people, people kill people. I saw that repeated a few times throughout the slides and articles. And it was really interesting to me because kind of going along the same lines as the human culpability views of disaster, it is something I had never thought about before. So it doesn't really make sense to me at this point, but I'm sure I'll learn more about it throughout the semester. And then the last question was that if we had to lead in-person class on this week's topic, what is one question that I would ask? And I think something I would ask to start off the class would be if anyone in the class has experienced a disaster, and do you believe that it was caused by human acts or if it was just caused by nature or an act of God? I think it's really interesting to talk about because I feel like a lot of people have different perspectives, and it'd be really cool to hear what everyone had to say.